Hello! Welcome to the mini lecture on fairy tales. Before I start the lecture, I would like to invite you to think of as many fairy tales as possible that you have watched, read, or heard. The tales you have grown up with. Which one is your favorite? And why? Sound out below on the comment section. So let's start with the etymological root of the term fairy tale. So this term can be said to be created quite recently. By recently, I meant as recent as the 17th century. It was actually derived from a French phrase, Le Conte de Fées, which was the title of a book written by Countess d'Aulnoy in 1697. It was later translated into Tales of the Fairies. As many scholars pinpointed, the translation later became a misnomer, in which, after its first introduction to England in the 19th century, later works that bear some resemblances to Countess d'Aulnoy's work, which came to England either from France or Germany or Italy, were also incorrectly translated as fairy tale. Probably it is of benefit for you to search the term Martian it's a German word that actually was translated into fairy tales incorrectly. So, the misnomer has remained to this date. That is why some other scholars choose to call it magic tale or wonder tale instead. Now, let's talk about its definition. Strictly speaking, fairy tales should mean tales about or with fairy characters in them, as the name suggests. However, the term has been popularly used to refer to tales without any fairy characters at all, such as Hansel and Gretel and Little Red Riding Hood. You probably remember that there's no such character as a fairy in Hansel and Gretel and also in Little Red Riding Hood, but these tales are still called fairy tales. So now, let's talk about the general characteristics of a fairy tale. At least, fairy tales can be distinguished by three main things. First, most fairy tales contain magic elements. These magic elements may be in the form of magic characters such as fairies, dwarves, talking animals, mermaids, and can you name some other magic characters that you won't find in real life? And then it may also be in the form of magic props and settings such as flying carpets, magic sword, a city of chocolate, an unseen jungle, etc. The next distinguishing character of fairy tale is a typical setting in which usually it is set in a faraway place such as a faraway kingdom, a faraway jungle, a faraway castle. In other words, we can't really find the geographical location of the setting because it is totally fictional and totally far away. And it is also set in the unknown time. Of course, we remember the famous opening of almost all fairy tales, Once Upon a Time. And some fairy tales are usually set in European medieval civilization. The last characteristic of the fairy tale is its typical plots. So mostly the plot will center around issues of how people, especially those of the lower classes, struggle to make justice prevail. And justice will usually, at the end of the story, prevail. And the story will also be revolving around how the bad will always get punished and the good will always be rewarded. So people who are jealous, wicked, evil will always get punished, and those who have good virtues, such as honesty, kindness, will always be rewarded. By now, you are probably wondering why fairy tales seem to share some similar characteristics with other kinds of tales that you might have encountered or read, such as legends or myths. Well, the answer is because many scholars, such as Jack Zipes, Ashleyman, and Luthi, agree that fairy tales were rooted in the oral tradition of folklore, particularly folk tales. Especially Jack Zipes, he argues that fairy tales are the literary version of folk tales. In other words, fairy tales were adapted from folk tales. So writers in the 17th century onwards, or maybe earlier than that century, wrote fairy tales loosely based from folk tales, and they created fairy tales, of course, with the literary conventions such as theme, plot, setting, characters. That's why folk tales are considered the crude version, and fairy tales are considered the fine version of folk tales. Well, I believe I will have to spend another presentation to explain the socio-historical background of fairy tales and why fairy tales came to be considered as the literary version of folk tales. But for the time being, let's stop on that point first, and let's see the figure. So as the figure shows, many scholars such as Ashleyman, from whom I adapted classification below, include fairy tales under the oral tradition of folk tales. Interestingly, some other scholars prefer to treat the fairy tale as a separate genre of verbal folklore or folk narrative that is on the same level as myths, legends, and folk tales. So, instead of having three main forms, they argue that there are four main forms of folk narratives, adding fairy tales into the picture. I promise I will give you another presentation of why fairy tales came to be considered as a separate genre. Now let's again focus on the figure. So in this classification that Ashleyman created, that I adapted from Ashleyman, Ashleyman himself actually adapted the classification of folk tales from NTR and Steve Thompson's folktale types. These two figures are very important in the tradition of folklore. And as you can see in the folktale classification, it is a little bit hard to find the place of fairy tale. In fact, you won't find fairy tales in them, because what we find instead is actually tales of magic under the subtype of ordinary folk tales. So that's why it is a little bit tricky to actually classify fairy tales, and scholars seem to at some point have agreements, but at some other points they seem to be disagreeing over, for instance, how to classify fairy tales, like what is actually the place of fairy tales in the folklore tradition. Okay, so I think my presentation has come to end. I hope you enjoyed it, and please look forward to more presentations on fairy tales. See you on the next mini lecture.